So fascinating. Yeah, it really is. Okay, so Hume obviously wrote extensively about ethics and morality. I think it would be interesting to delve into his ideas about moral sentiments um, and their role in ethical decision making.
Yeah, so this is where Hume has obviously been very, very influential, but where I think is his weakest part of his philosophy. So I myself don't follow Hume in the realm of ethics because I think that his view just ends up having very implausible consequences. Consequences that Hume himself admits. Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my little finger. And so what he's saying is that like ethics is fundamentally about the sentiments that we feel. And so if we feel the sentiment of desperately not wanting to cut our little finger off, um, but we don't have a similar sentiment about the destruction of the whole world, that mismatch in sentiment is not contrary to reason. There's not something about a relation of an idea that it was impressed upon us from the world that will make that contrary to reason. And so I don't think that's right. But there are a lot of people that do um, think that Hume's what is called ethical sentimentalism really is all there is to our moral discourse. And so if we want to know what it is we should do morally, we should look inside and see how observing certain acts strikes us. So if we were to imagine the idea of a child being tortured merely for fun, that sentiment would strike us with horror. We would have this impulse from within to say that no, that's not something that we should do. And so that this concept of should or ought or must doesn't go beyond this human sentiment. So in a very real sense, Hume reduces ethics to psychology. It's not a matter like when we ask, what should I do? The question we should think that question states is, what do I most want? Or what is my strongest sentiment in this situation? And so that, to my mind, is a psychological question. And so Hume puts forward what's often called a subjectivist view of ethics, kind of a naturalist. There's still truths about, he's not a non-cognitivist. He's not saying that our moral language doesn't function the way we think it does. He just thinks that the clockwork of ethics is limited to those passions that we feel, the sentiments that arise when we make judgments, and so that's just the only material that we have for ethics to go by. And so modern, what are called ethical constructivists, and a good example would be Sharon Street. She's what's called a Humean constructivism. And she thinks that, look, our systems of ethics, of morals, are just our systems of sentiments. We construct ethics in the sense that we build elaborate systems that fit human sentiments. Our morality takes the shape that it does because human sentiments take the shape that it does. And so that there aren't things like status independent or stance independent facts about what we should do, or about what is good and bad, or about what is right and wrong. And so Hume was not only influential in that meta-ethical realm of his sentimentalism, but he was also a forerunner to people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, so the utilitarian tradition that developed in the English-speaking world in Hume's wake. Hume was very influential in that respect too. Obviously, Hume's famous contribution to ethics. The one that I do accept is his famous distinction between is and ought. And so what Hume is getting at is that he notices in a lot of moral philosophy, there's this movement from judging the way the world is to then judging the way the world ought to be. And so he thinks that these are just different concepts. And so that if you have nothing but premises that make judgments about the way the world is, nothing of any moral significance, no ought truth is going to follow from that. And so what we get from Hume is this very sharp distinction between a domain of is facts and a domain of ought facts. But then Hume goes on to reduce those ought facts. Once he's made those those conceptual clarifications, he then reduces the ought concepts to is ones. And so I think he ultimately falls on his own sword here. This is the idea. Well, why I say I don't follow Hume and his ethics is I think that there's this very deep tension between Hume's is-ought distinction on the one hand and his sentimentalism on the other. I think those are on a collision course, that we can either accept one or the other. If we're going to reduce morality to psychology, then we're going to have to reject the is-ought gap. If we want to say that no, is and ought really are two distinct conceptual frameworks that state different truths, then we're not going to be able to reduce ethics to sentimentalism. And so I think that's just kind of a dilemma that Hume's philosophy, he wasn't omniscient. Hume didn't get everything right. And I think that this is just a very obvious way of seeing, like, hey, Hume was, for all the brilliance and all the influence that these thoughts have had, these don't fit together. And that's not unheard of in philosophy. So Wittgenstein is a very similar figure in that there's considered this earlier Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein, and they just don't fit. Like, you just can't reconcile the two. All you can do is say, look, here's one way of reading the Tractatus, and then here's another way of reading the Philosophical Investigations. One of them is going to undermine the other. They can't both be true. And I think that's just kind of where we're left with Hume's ethics. In, if he wants to reduce ethics to the relations of ideas and matters of fact, he's not going to be able to use that is-ought distinction. And if he uses that is-ought distinction, he's going to need something more than his moral sentimentalism.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.